Good day and welcome to another edition of Royal Holloway's Geography for Schools lecture series. My name is Dr. Agostinho Pinnock, and the title of this talk is Blackness, Placelessness, and Britain, the Case of Windrush. This talk is being organized into two parts, and the reason I'm doing that is because the big ideas that we want to, in a sense, work our way through, it's kind of important in a way, the place and this concept of placelessness, it's important that in a way we pin those down in order to be able to get to where we want to go. And to do that, I thought it was easier to have a part one and a part two to this conversation. So, what then are the learning outcomes that we're trying to achieve today? At the end of this conversation, we want to be able to define place, we want to be able to talk about what placemaking is, and we want to talk about placelessness in geography, and specifically the subfield of Black geographies. And then we want to, in a sense, identify a range of contemporary and historical examples here in Britain. And we want to also demonstrate, we want to be able to demonstrate how Windrush maps onto that concept. So that then will give us our map for how we will proceed. So the key questions that we're asking as we're working through this lecture are: what is placelessness and how is it related to Britain? What is the link to Blackness and Windrush? And so to start us off, the plan then for the lecture, as I've said before, is to talk about place and placelessness in geography, to outline the distinctions between and the complements between Black geographies and geography more broadly, and to cite examples from Windrush, to briefly consider whether placelessness can be applied to other groups as well. That part is a kind of take-home question for you to reflect on, and it's not necessarily intended to be something that we will focus on in any serious way in this talk. So in the first part of the talk, then we will talk about the essentialist and humanist approaches to place. We look at some of the push and pull factors that impact how place is understood, and we'll also talk a little bit about a global sense of place, because in many ways that's related to what we're talking about. We'll look at place making, what might that entail, and then we'll talk about place and race, whatever that is, and we will also talk about what I'm calling black spaces. So let us move very quickly then. So when we talk about place, often we're referring to a material and physical reality, meaning certain kinds of geographies that are very material, are very physical, in which people live. So we associate living and place almost in the same breath. And so we think about they live in that place over there. They live in that town, they live in that village. And so place is it's material. We can drive to that place, we can see it, we can understand in that kind of way. But sometimes we're also referring to being out of place. And what we mean when we say that is there's a sense, there's some emotions that are attached to that. There's a feeling of dislocation. We feel dislocated. We've traveled abroad. We are moving on to a new class. We are in a new community. And so we're learning something new. And so we feel very out of place. Some people are ahead of us and others perhaps are behind, but we ourselves are feeling a sense of disorientation. So we want to move then to the idea of the humanist and the essentialist approaches to place. And in the essentialist notion of place, they argue that place is fixed. It's a fixed material reality that is exclusively the domain of specific groups of people. And this might be based on ideas of race, nationality, ethnicity, or even gender. And so you can see that a lot of those things are linked. They are their own thing, obviously. But in a way, we share common borders based on our race. We share common borders based on our national identity. We share common borders based on our ethnicity. And we share common borders or common places based on ideas of gender. And so we can think of place through that, through those kinds of logics. What we mean when we say that, for example, would be a thing like women's only gyms, for instance, or prayer places that are exclusively for women, cloistered nuns who live in a convent. We can think of national borders that you then need a passport or a visa to cross those borders because you don't nat naturally occur or live in such a place. And so, what that means then is there is a way in which place becomes a kind of border that we're crossing over. And we're thinking here of those borders as a kind of natural boundary that is separating people based on these different characteristics. So, as I said before, the essentialist notion of place is reliant on a view of fixity, the idea that this it is self-evident and it's materially embedded. So, we can see it, we can experience it, and we all understand what we mean when we say that. Of course, when people say those things, it's often very problematic because very often we all don't share the same ideas. But we'll get to that eventually. So, occupiers of place are considered homogeneous. We are alike because we eat the same foods, we have the same customs, we speak the same languages, and so on and so forth. And so we share certain common characteristics amongst ourselves. Um, it is also, there's a criticism around it being defensively nationalistic. So borders, for example, are often actively policed in order to keep people who are not part of the nation or not part of this in group, to keep them out. And so they're considered outsiders. But very often, if they do cross those borders, if they eventually can cross the borders, then it makes the crossing of the border, the time that people spend within those borders, within those places, difficult because they're under scrutiny. They don't belong. And so this notion of belonging is very much bound up in this idea of place. So then we turn to this notion of humanist ideas of place, and we can think of globalization as a process that is helping us to understand that. Globalization is a highly asymmetrical process, which often may result in uneven geographies over inclusion and exclusion of different social groups and individuals. What do we mean by what do we mean by asymmetrical? Asymmetrical means it's unbalanced. When we think of symmetry, it's perfectly aligned. And so if it's an asymmetrical process, then people in many ways are not having the same experience. And so the extent to which they can be included in a place or the extent to which they are excluded from that place may vary depending on a number of different things. You may have a parent who was born in that place, but you grew up somewhere else. You may look like that community, but you don't share the same sets of values. So you're included to a certain extent, but you're excluded in many other ways. And so we're constantly negotiating the levels of access. And so the geographies of that, the inclusion and the exclusion, are uneven. And so that's what we mean by asymmetrical. And globalization, the ways in which the world is being connected through the compression of time and space, travel, makes the time to move from place to place increasingly less as compared to, say, in the past. And so globalization in many ways is underpinning how places are changing. So, in the humanist approach, scholars such as Doreen Massey, Tim Cresswell, and a number of others are often talking about different ways in which place is open-ended. There's an open-endedness to it, meaning that there's a way in which it can change at any particular time. Of course, there are factors within that global context that are going to impact the extent to which those changes will occur, but the fact is it can change. And so there's an open-endedness to place. It's not fixed. Unlike the essentialist view, there's a fragmentation around ideas of place. And by ideas here, we're talking about, so we grew up in this place, but then we moved away, and possibly another group of people have settled. They don't speak the language that we spoke. So the character of the community changes over time because there are different groups of people who now occupy that place. And what that means is that place and culture are linked together. It's what we call they're imbricated in each other. And so there's a fragmentation of that. It could be because for any number of reasons, there could be wars that could cause this sense of the splintering, people on the move. And so once you're on the move, you're traveling with a memory of the place that you lived in, but in many ways the memory and the reality now are not one and the same. And where you're going to as well is going to impact how you will then think about the sense of nostalgia that's attached to that. So places in this sense then are comprised of heterogeneous groups. And so within this complex array of groups of people moving into and out of place, it means that we no longer have one stable, homogeneous group, one stable, homogeneous identity around place. And remember that places are very fundamental to the notion of identity. Our identities are rooted in place. And so if we're all thinking about place in very different ways, what it means is that we have what we might consider a contestation around the different identities that are existing in that place. And so place then in this setup is constantly being made and remade. There is a way in which we are thinking about place in different ways. You're traveling away from a particular location that you grew up in, and for whatever sets of reasons, the character of that community might change. But in your head, you have a view of that place. And so you go back to that memory. You're remaking that place routinely. And so this is what we mean when we say that we have these humanistic views. It's not the sort of fixed permanent idea that we had in the essentialist view. We also have what we call a global sense of place, and very much, of course, linked to what we're discussing here, where Massey argues that a better way to think about place is through what she's calling the global sense of place, which it conforms to the logic of a place as representing global flows and movements, which is that these are then linked to the global trends, of people moving into and out of place, and there are push and pull factors that impact that. And so, what are some of these push and pull factors? Some of the push and pull factors would include things like war, economic migration, natural disasters. People are moving out of place because these things are happening. We're living in a time where we're talking about natural disasters such as caused by climate change, hurricanes. We can think of forest fires, things that will cause the place in which people live to be no longer habitable. And so they have to move to another place where they can find some sense of security and stability. And so those become push factors that push them out of place. We can then think of pull factors. And for pull factors, there are opportunities that are attracting us to a particular place. There are opportunities for educational advancement. There's opportunity for economic stability. We want to build, we want to own a home, we want to build families, and we want a stable existence. And so we are attracted to places that we feel can provide that kind of outcome for us. We are also attracted to the notion of peaceful societies. So if we're coming from a place where there is war is pushing us out of place, that means we are now moving towards a place that we perceive as being peaceful. And so, of course, we then get attracted to societies where the likelihood of wars being fought within those societies are increasingly, well, there are not that many recorded incidents of that. And that becomes part of what attracts us to that place, a pull factor. Strong political structures. So we feel that there's an opportunity for our rights to be respected so that we can exist freely in a way that we couldn't somewhere else. And so that becomes part of the attraction to place. So placemaking then, to come to that, placemaking is the deliberate shaping of an environment to improve a community's quality of life and to facilitate social interaction. What it does, it brings together a variety of social and political and economic imperatives which are intended to make places habitable and desirable for certain groups of people. More broadly, though, placemaking also involves how media branding of that place, such as the creation of heritage and cultural quarters in cities can also work to make that place habitable, desirable. We want to live in this place because we feel that that place represents our values. And so placemaking is a combination of these big technocratic urban planning kind of processes. And at the same time, it also includes the ways in which media and culture are also impacting the production of place. And so here we can think at a more basic level then placemaking is referring to how people use culture and other things to make a place livable. We can think of murals on a wall, graffiti. We can think of parks where people are doing all kinds of things. We can think of poetry readings, street music festivals, street art, and the list goes on, carnivals, and so on and so forth. And so all of these things are helping to produce a notion of place. And so we're making place. And that what that implies as well is that place can be the idea of making place is also an impermanent thing, because in the same way we can make place, it can also be unmade. And so we have to really keep those ideas in mind as we're thinking about that. Again, some more ideas around places being made through cultural activities. So poetry reading, art galleries, festivals of one kind or another. And that's very important for us to think about what it means to be placeless, what it means to be out of place. The idea that, culture is so very much tied up with our sense of place, then once we get into the concept of being out of place, then, it has implications to how culture is part of that conversation. So place and race are also linked. Effectively, racial and ethnic differences make places what they are. And so we can think here, one good way of thinking about that would be like places like Chinatown. We know of little Cubas and little Italies and so on and so forth. But we can also think of places which some might argue are more abstract, but perhaps aren't. We can think of places like Black Paris. The idea of Black Paris means that within Paris itself, what happened was at the turn of the last century, when there was a lot of, or perhaps somewhere in the 1930s thereabout, when there was a lot of talk around decolonization. Now, France is a colonial empire, or was a colonial empire, and so people from all parts of the empire in Africa, the Caribbean, and you name it, would converge on Paris. And there's a lot of thinking about what it means to be French, what it means to be French African, what does it mean to be French Caribbean, and a lot of that dialogue, those people living together, the art they were producing, the conversations they were having, the books they were writing, a lot of that was then called the production then of Black Paris. And of course, that could be even more physical in many ways, where certain people live in certain parts of a city. And so if you go to, say, San Francisco, for example, Chinatown is distinguished by the fact that you enter Chinatown in San Francisco and you think you are in China. And what is also important to remember here is that Chinatowns that exist outside of, say, China are in many ways a microcosm, a representation, or a representation of ideas and memories of China. And so people are recreating China in this new place that they now live. And so there's a relationship, a relationality, a spatial relationship, a political, a cultural relationship between Chinatown and China, in much the same way that there is that relationship between Black Paris and the places that these French nationals who were not necessarily born in France, though some of them were, have. And so they're recreating an idea of what they think their homeland is inside that geography. So we want to then turn to what are the characteristics of when we talk about place and race in geography? an example for us to think about here, this idea of race. Race as a construct, race as an idea that has been manufactured in a way to engineer and to maintain borders and differences between people on the premise of how they looked, but also very importantly, on the premise of where they came from. And so there is a notion, for example, in not just geography, but for our purposes, we'll talk about geography. But there is a notion, for example, that people of African descent and who then became black along the way. And I'm not going to get into the longer conversation around the transatlantic slave trade, but it very much is informing what we're thinking about here. And so the idea that people who were from the African continent, the black peoples, lived in the hot zones of the world, the torrid zones. And those kinds of ideas were predicated on a notion that Europeans, the white people, lived in the cooler parts of the world. And now, what people did was they had an association between hot and passions, cooler and thought. And so that kind of binary separation is traveling with us as we think about place. Because what we then have is a situation where you're from the torrid zones, and the implications of that are that you now are very given to, you wear your passions on your sleeve very much, and you're not very given to a lot of deep, serious thinking. And this is where black geographies comes and disrupts a lot of these ideas. Black geographies is, and I think perhaps it is that I'm preempting myself. So let me just back up and go back to this conversation around the idea of the torrid zone, blackness, and so on and so forth, as part of something that we're thinking about, not just in geography. We see that in sociology, we see that in history, these long histories around how we have shaped those processes, how those processes have been shaped over time. So Africa was originally dubbed the Dark Continent by Welsh journalist and explorer Henry Morton Stanley, who saw Africa as mysterious. Its landscapes and cultures were largely unknown to many outsiders until the late 19th century or thereabout. And so people really didn't have a sense of Africa, and there's a great deal of ignorance around that, which also influenced the idea of people living in the hot parts of the world, the torrid zone given to their passions. It's dark, it's mysterious. And those ideas have traveled with us over time and have taken on even more pernicious meanings as we think about that. And this is a period in geography now, as it relates to our purposes here. This is a period when geography was considered um, geography was on its discovery of the world. It's being used to settle and organize the world. Geography militant. This is really an aside. I just to say that that's really an aside to come to the bigger point around how ideas of race and place are linked together, what we call entangled or imbricated in each other, so that there is that long history that precedes how we think about a sub-discipline like black geographies and blackness and placemaking, which then takes us into the question of Windrush and so on and so forth. So now we come to this question of the part two of that. Having established the conversation at that level, we want to then think about what we mean by black geographies. What do we mean by a black sense of place? Placelessness, different forms of placemaking, and the Windrush example. So let us move on very quickly then. Black geographies, and I've been talking about that, but I want to just define that very carefully here. Black geographies is a subfield in geography. And what that means is over time, geography has been critiqued as not creating enough space for the critical attention that is needed for Black geographers and for Black cultures and peoples more specifically. And so Black geographies are focusing on different ways in which Black people and their multiple productions of space and place are operating throughout time. And so this now is what we are seeing is as geography becomes more decolonized, meaning there's more space being created inside the discipline itself from all the various geographers that have come into the discipline over time. We are seeing that there's this particular strand of geography that's called Black geographies, which is of concern to us. So why does any of this matter? This matters because as we think about the ideas around how places are made, when we think about how this notion of being out of place, when we think about how race, and in this specific instance, blackness becomes part of that conversation. One of the schools of thought, or one of the branches or sub branches within geography that has been very instrumental in getting us to understand that has been black geographic or black geographical thinking and scholarship. So black geographies are centering blackness to explore the geographic, the social, the political, the racial, the ecological, cultural, economic processes, and the spatial patterns that constitutes how people think about and make place. And so this is what we want to talk about. So I'm going to jump over these slides. You can read those at your own leisure because I've pretty much explained them. This is just really a lot of the theorists talking about that. So we're going to move beyond that very quickly. Again, I've just put up some pictures of Black British geographers who are doing some of this work. Professor James Essen, Professor Patricia Knoxville, Dr. Rita Gale, and Dr. Nathaniel Telemack as some examples. For our purposes, we want to come to a fairly established name within the discipline, and she's very helpful for us in thinking about the idea of what I am talking about today as a black sense of place. Her argument is that there's a particular way in which black people over time have created place, and and that is in the aftermath of the transatlantic slave trade, the plantation and colonialism, how those forces have worked together to impact how place is then created within certain black places. And her name is Katherine McKittrick. Again, what she's saying here sounds very theoretical, but what she's arguing effectively is that there is a cycle that is informing the way that we think of Black lives as expendable. They're marginalized, they have no real value in society. And so she says here, I mean, overlook the theoretical language that she's using. She basically has said what I'm saying. This is the cyclical and death dealing numeration of the condemned remains intact. In other words, there's a way in which the colonial antecedents that are part of geography is very much present. They're very much present with us today, and that is informing a lot of how we think about the idea of Black people being in place. And so we want to turn our attention then to a black sense of place. What exactly is that? What are these people talking about? What does any of that have to do with humanism, with humanistic geographies and globalization? What does any of that have to do with Windrush? I think is the question we really are trying to think about. And placelessness, how are those things connected? So, according to McKittrick, Black people have always conducted what she calls spatially complex and diverse lives. Yet, geography primarily, but not exclusively, so we see this all over the place, there has not been an attention to those things. There's not been a representation of that in the scholarship. And so that there is need for us to become more focused on those things as the only way that we can, create more just and livable societies. Remember, we're thinking about place and the implications of the fact that we have ignored and have purposely marginalized certain groups means that there is a way in which we don't ever think of them as people deserving of justice. So she says, however, they have simultaneously struggled with the routine denial and erasure of their reality within the post-plantation period. And post-plantation here just means the period after plantation and colonial plantation politics and colonialism. So after this period of time, we're still living with the after effects of that, the afterlives of it. And so this is what she's talking about here. So a black sense of place then is rooted in black people's struggles to to be considered human, to be taken seriously, to not be dehumanized. And when we get to Windrush, we see a lot of those examples. The struggle to remain in Britain, the struggle to get compensation, the struggle to be taken seriously as having contributed to the development of the society in a real sense. Those are the kinds of concerns that McKittrick is talking about here. And so she says that they use a range of creative practices as ways to disrupt some of these exclusionary borders. So geography's efforts to recognize this is part of what we would call decolonization, in direct response to the ways in which colonial uh, policies and practices and histories have helped to shape an understanding of the world where certain people are rendered invisible. We don't see them, we don't think they're valuable, we don't appreciate their contributions to society. So this is what we're talking about here. And in a way, this then sets up our conversation around what we call placelessness. So what is placelessness? There are two broad definitions of placelessness that we want to think about, and placelessness holds a lot of importance in geography. However, it is also highly contested. And so part of the reason for this is the everyday usage of its meaning, as we've talked about, place is often assumed to be obvious and self-evident. People assume they know what you mean when you say that. But the person who has been very instrumental in getting us to really think about place, there have been several scholars, placelessness. There have been several scholars, but Edward Ralph in 1976, his influential text, Place and Placelessness, first coined the term placelessness to signify locations and physical structures that do not reflect the unique or the local ways of their immediate surroundings. So the term placelessness is therefore marked by what he calls an inauthentic attitude, which involves no awareness of the deep and the symbolic significance of places and no appreciation of their identities. So what he's basically saying here then, that placelessness refers to the idea that places are losing their uniqueness in the increasingly globalized, that word, nature of modern urbanization. There are popular expectations of urban places that are often replicated all over the place. So that's one version of placelessness. What we mean when we say that is, think of the British High Street as an example. The British High Street is replicated all over the place. It's a model that people have come to expect. And so when that happens, places lose their unique characteristics. There's a way in which, if we are lifting up that idea and plunking it down wherever, then there's nothing unique about that place. That's one version of it. It might be related to what we're thinking about, but that's not the application as it relates to Windrush that we're interested in. But placelessness also refers to people's inability to form a permanent or long-term attachment to a place. And if we go back to the idea of the humanistic view of place, that, for whatever sets of reasons, we are on the go. Places are parts of global flows, so that the character of places, it's changing all the time, but the people within those places are also changing. And so the sense of place that one holds is very much attached to the ways in which one lives in these kinds of, or is unable to live in these kinds of places. And so we can think here of what I just mentioned about a black sense of place within the post-plantation era. After the end of colonialism, we've still managed to create a very, in Britain, we talk about the hostile environment. The hostile environment, one could argue, is a way that's attached to those ideas. And the hostile environment makes it difficult for new arrivals, or it makes it difficult for certain groups of people to settle and to live in a way that they could then develop a very stable notion of being in place. And so their identity is constantly shaped by those ideas. Windrush is a good example of that. But again, I'm jumping ahead of myself. So forces like gentrification, you know, the ways in which when we are then thinking about the development of certain communities, how those things can help to push people out of place. So you're being priced out of your community because the new model of development that they're using is not one that takes account of the people who, for whatever sets of reasons, have lived there but cannot now buy property or own property within this newly developed model. The price of rent goes up, the price of housing goes up, and services become difficult for people to get because they can no longer really participate in the economy and in the reality, the social life of that community. Those are things that are undermining a sense of your place in that space. And so this is part of what we're referring to as placelessness. We can think as well about the deportations of peoples of Caribbean descent in Britain, and we hear all the times the numbers of flights that are leaving with people for whatever sets of reasons. You know, they go. Some people have gone overseas for funerals, and upon returning are not allowed to re-enter the country. And so all of those are things that are undermining a sense of people's place, their idea of belonging, their sense of attachment. All right. So so placelessness then conveys a sense of constantly being on the move, very often not by choice, though there is a sense that that could also be by choice. And so we have to think about here how nomadic communities like the Kalahari Bushmen and the Maasai peoples in Kenya, for example, they're nomadic people, and so they're on the go. And so the idea of place for them is very fluid. They have a general place that they live in, but they're never attached in any one way to any one place in relation to that. But we can also think of members of the traveler community here in Britain, coming back to this question of how can we then relate the concept of placelessness, being out of place, being dislocated? How can we relate that to other groups? So we're speaking about the specific case of Windrush, but it can also have applications to other groups as well. So, what is Windrush then? And here we have a map of the Caribbean. And most of the people who are part of what we call the Windrush generation came from the Caribbean, broadly Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, but those were not the only places. But we identify those as the two key points of origin in 1948 when the ship docked at Tilbury. But race and place, what do we mean by race and place? What we talked about, the idea that some people live in darkest Africa, for example, and we talk about the torrid zones, for example, and so we associate certain geographies with an idea of race. It is part of a way that we think of race as making place and place as making race. So the two things are linked. So racialization in geography very much is very predicated on the idea of place. Okay, and so if we use the US as an example, we can look at, according to Shamsid, Dean, and Porter, they argue that Black people have historically um, and currently employ innovative methodologies of Black placemaking. Remember, we talked about placemaking through culture, through a number of different strategies, in the creation of sites of endurance, of belonging, and also resistance through social interaction. So we need to keep in mind that when people are making place, they're also resisting. They're resisting the idea of being on the go all the time. They're trying to put roots down, so they're using different ways of trying to disrupt some of that. And so the implications of that then are that race, in this case blackness, has always been linked to the different ways in which Black people create a sense of place, a Black sense of place, as we've talked about, meaning their attachments to and their sense of belonging both within and to that place. And we will talk in a sense later about the creation of Carnival, for instance, the Notting Hill Carnival. So Windrush in Britain. I want to, in a sense, focus on that as a way, as an example of what we mean by placelessness. And so, what is Windrush exactly? As you know, the ship, the HMT Windrush, docked at Tilbury docks, carrying passengers from the Caribbean, ready to start a new life in Britain. And this was in the post-war period in 1948. There were An ad was put in the paper, in the Caribbean, asking people to come and to help rebuild Britain, because this was, like I said, right at the end of World War II, and so people responded to that ad. They were coming to participate in the rebuilding of the empire. They considered themselves British, and so, for all intents and purposes, they were British. They arrived, and a lot of them, not all, but a lot of them also contributed to the development of the National Health Service, because a lot of Caribbean people who came at that point also were employed in that sector. So here I've written that less than a month after their arrival, on July 5 in 1948, the National Health Service opened its doors for the first time, and many of those same migrants on that ship worked in the NHS and were instrumental to helping to build up the service to what it is today. And so this is also part of how people are building up a sense of their place in the society. In 1948, again, here, a landing card, entry certificate, when the Windrush ship came to England, apparently there were 500 servicemen. It was taking 500 servicemen who had participated in the war, taking them back to their homelands in the Caribbean, and then people boarded, and came back. And so, really, there is that kind of mutuality, that relationship. There is a dialogue, one could almost say, that is going on between Britain and its Caribbean colonies at the time, and the way in which place is being negotiated in that relationship. Okay, so here's a shot of the ship. Um, so black placemaking in Britain then, using Windrush. And so at the top here, I have an image of Tilbury docks, and below it, an image of Brixton. And I'm focusing very specifically on that as a way, a point of understanding what we mean as part of the way that blackness and place, black places in Britain, one could argue that Brixton is one of those places. It is, and people are making that place what it is. One, they have started to work in the NHS, they have settled in this community, they are making they've brought their culture, their food, their identity is bound up in that place. But for whatever sets of reasons, because we're thinking about placelessness, for whatever sets of reasons, those things are now going to become under threat. They are, remember what we said at the beginning, there are push and pull factors that impact, and these are part of a broader global set of forces that we're thinking about. So there's Brixton, for this discussion, it's not the only site, but it is a key site of black placemaking in Britain, and in particular, a blackness that is emanating from the people who came from the Caribbean. Now, people could say that this is Caribbean placemaking. That's one argument. And people could say that it's not really black, because we very often think of black as being in America. But for our purposes, we're going to say it's black placemaking in Britain. The British context has its own unique geographies. So we want to talk about some of the ways that people were able to disrupt the kinds of prejudices that they faced when they moved to Britain. And I want to focus here on this question of carnival in Britain. And this picture that we're looking at is of a woman called Claudia Jones. And Claudia Jones originally came from Trinidad and Tobago. And so she was an activist in the community at the time. When the community arrived, they faced tremendous difficulties. If you've had a chance, you can watch this film series called Small Acts. And Small Acts, in a way, gives I think there are 5 films in that series, and it gives a sort of uh, filmic representation of that history. It's not the completed history, but it does give that sense. And they faced all kinds of hurdles in the settling in the society. Again, remember, we're thinking about the fixed ideas of place attached to national borders, place attached to questions of race and ethnicity, and these kinds of things were the forces at work in the society in 1948 and beyond when Caribbean people settled in Britain. And so they faced stiff opposition in so many different ways. And so part of dealing with that was the development of the Notting Hill Carnival. It was a way for Caribbean people who had settled here to share their culture with British society. And this woman, Claudia Jones, was instrumental in doing that. So this is part of overcoming the challenges of placelessness. So Notting Hill Carnival has its origins in the carnival traditions of the Caribbean and the social and the political conditions of the post-1948 migration of peoples from the Caribbean. A Caribbean carnival, it was held on January 30, 1959 in St. Pancras Town Hall as a response to the problematic state of race relations at the time, the UK's first widespread racial attacks, the Notting Hill race riots, in which 108 people were charged, had occurred the previous year. So again, remember what we said, that in placemaking, and when we begin to think of place in a particular kind of way, who are these people coming, these outsiders coming in to take over? Even if they're not doing that, that's a kind of idea that we're working with, because we have these fixed ideas in our heads as to what place is, and their arrival is disrupting some of that. And so, as a way to kind of, find some kind of middle ground, Claudia Jones develops this carnival to be able to share with uh, the host community that they live in. And here we have a video of Notting Hill Carnival, which gives us a sort of insight into the past. We can see, well, we have a little ad here, but we can see some of the ways, in which that carnival emerged over time. So we want to move on then very quickly. Um, we want to move on to this idea of changing place. And so in immigrating to Britain, those who came were permitted to stay without a time limit. Remember, they were British citizens. Um, they were part of the empire, and so in many ways they were British. Well, not in many ways, they were British. When the Immigration Act of 1971 came into force on January 1, 1973, the position of these Commonwealth citizens was preserved. Importantly, the Act preserved the right to come and go of those who had already arrived. It also recognized the right of their wives, not husbands and children, to join them. And so what that meant, their wives, not husbands. So basically, there are limits on how they can access this place that they're living in or have settled in. And so we begin to see how state forces are impacting the production of place. And so in changing place from the Caribbean to Britain, they're now facing these hurdles. Those who came were permitted to stay without time limit, as we said. Um, the Immigration Act of 1988 changed that. The Commonwealth citizens, like other people settled in the UK, would lose the right to remain indefinitely after 2 years' absence. So if you had gone home, wherever home is, or gone back to where you had come from originally, then you couldn't return if 2 years had passed. It also removed the general right of wives and children to join them. And we see a lot of those kinds of concerns in today's modern day contemporary Britain, still very much informed by that. And so we could argue that the state is part of an instrument that is being used. These are state instruments that are impacting the extent to which people can make place and can belong in the society that they live in. The new Home Office guidance makes no mention of the partners and the children who arrived from 1973. It also fails to acknowledge that until the 1st of August 1988, there was no restriction on the length of time a Commonwealth citizen could leave the UK while retaining the right to return. All of these are different ways in which place now is under threat, and so the idea then of changing place, moving from one place to another and coming to this place, the Immigration Act of 1988 is also impacting this concept of placelessness. There's a way in which people are being displaced. They are out of place. And the displacement could be they've traveled from this one location. It could be they're unable to settle in this particular location. But regardless of what the reasons are, people are experiencing a sense of being displaced, out of place. There is a sense of placelessness. There is something where we cannot feel a strong sense of belonging. And remember what we talked about, the hostile environment as a way in which we can think about a lot of the ideas around placelessness as it relates to Windrush. Windrush is an example because Britain, again, a fixed notion of place based on race, based on nationality. These outsiders do not belong. They're not part of this place that we live in. And so, there are these things that are happening that are undermining their sense of belonging to the place they live in. And I just want to end another video. My first video didn't show, but hopefully you can click on the links and see it. And this one is called You Called, We Came. It's an NHS video with some young people talking about the history of Caribbean people since Windrush settling in Britain. And again, these are ways, thinking of carnival as one way, thinking of music and culture and food and language and so many different ways as ways in which people are sharing their culture and using that to resist and undermine the erosion of their sense of place. One can argue then that what we're seeing through the carnival, through the music, through the food, through the culture, so on and so forth, that is a way that Black people in Britain with Caribbean roots have attempted to maintain and to found, to be able to establish a Black sense of place. Well, that then takes us to the end of my talk, and I just really want to thank you for staying for the duration of the talk, and I look forward to your questions in the follow-up discussion segment if there is one. Thank you very much. My name is Agostinho Pinnock. This has been another in the uh, lecture series for Geography for Schools for Royal Holloway. Thank you so very much.